There's a sound a station makes when something has gone wrong. Not an alarm, not a klaxon, not the computerized voices that tell you to evacuate or seal your quarters or move to safe corridors in an orderly fashion. Those sounds come after. The sound I'm talking about comes before any of that. It's a kind of settling, like the station itself takes a breath and holds it. The ventilation shifts not off, but different, like the whole pressure system just hesitated for a half-second. The lights don't flicker. They just look slightly less certain than they did a moment ago, subtle enough that you think you imagined it. I've worked D-Prim logistics for 11 years. I know that sound. The morning it happened, I was 3 hours into my shift at Meridian Station Kappa 7, which is the kind of station name that tells you everything and nothing at the same time. Kappa 7 sits at the outer edge of what the galactic hegemony technically considers settled space, which is bureaucratic language for barely claimed, mostly ignored, and staffed by people who either had no better option or wanted to disappear. We handled cargo transfers, fuel depot management, customs clearance for independent traders, and the occasional emergency docking when a ship limped in from the deep lanes looking like it had been chewed on and spit out. We were not a military installation. We had 2 hegemony patrol shuttles for emergencies, a security team of 9 officers drawn mostly from species with decent physical tolerances, and exactly 1 human on the security staff, a woman named Sergeant Dale Okonkwo, who was technically our chief of station security by rank if not by official title, because the hegemony hadn't gotten around to formalizing the position before she filled it through sheer force of competence. We also had 42 permanent residents, about 130 rotating contractors and traders, and, as of 3 weeks before this story happened, 1 12-year-old human girl named Marin Volkov. Marin was not supposed to be there. This is not a judgment, it's just a fact. Kappa 7 wasn't designed for children, didn't have facilities for children, and our regulations technically prohibited minors on station without prior approval from 3 separate hegemony administrative offices, which in practice meant nobody ever bothered, because the approval process took about 8 months, and most people's business on Kappa 7 was resolved in days or weeks. Marin arrived with her father, Dr. Elias Volkov, who was a xenobotanist on contract to survey a recently discovered cluster of biologically active planetoids about 6 light hours from our position. He was supposed to be on station for a week while he filed his preliminary survey permits and arranged his equipment manifests. Then his survey ship, the Patience of Koval, had an engine failure, nothing catastrophic, nothing that a replacement injector assembly wouldn't fix, but the replacement had to come from Hegemony Logistics Depot Theta, which was 17 days away by standard freight. So Dr. Volkov and his daughter were stranded with us. And that was how Kappa 7 acquired, more or less by accident, the most dangerous 12-year-old in the Outer Rim. I didn't know she was dangerous. None of us did, not at first. That's usually how it goes with humans, I've found. You think you understand them, and then something happens and you realize you had no idea. The thing about humans is they're not consistently extraordinary. They're ordinary most of the time. They eat and sleep and make small jokes and complain about the recycled air and ask if there's anything on the station that isn't protein paste for the 3rd night in a row. They fit in. They blend. You forget, for long stretches, that they have that other thing living inside them, the thing that comes out when circumstances demand it. Marin was a small kid. I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean she was on the smaller end for human children her age, which my colleague Velthrin pointed out was still larger than most adult specimens of his species, the Thari, who average about 90 centimeters fully grown. But by human standards, she was compact. Brown hair that she kept in a practical braid. Dark eyes that were always moving, cataloging, measuring, memorizing. She had the kind of stillness when she wasn't talking that adult humans rarely have, like she was perpetually absorbing information. She was also, and I say this with complete sincerity, the most relentlessly curious creature I have ever encountered in 11 years of working a transit station that handles 100 different species. She asked questions constantly. She asked me, I'm a logistics coordinator, a Sethani, which means I have the general shape of what humans call a large frog crossed with a diplomat, what it felt like to navigate in zero gravity, whether I missed my home system, why cargo manifests used hegemony standard instead of the local trade pigeon, and whether I thought the ventilation system was suboptimal for mixed atmosphere environments. She was correct about the ventilation system. She asked Chief Engineer Ruthas why the station's sensor array had a 15-second lag on the outer perimeter sweep, and Ruthas, who was 800 years old and had designed more sensor arrays than most species had discovered hyperspace, told her it was a power allocation compromise between the array and the fuel depot monitoring system. She nodded like she was filing this away. I saw her sketching something on her personal pad later that afternoon. I didn't know what it was. She spent a lot of time in the observation bay, which was the large transparent panel room at the station's outer rim where you could look out at the stars and the void and feel properly small. Most visitors went there once, felt the existential enormity of deep space, and then went back to the interior sections where the walls were solid and the universe felt more manageable. Marin went there every day. She'd sit for hours with her legs folded under her, her pad in her lap, drawing or writing or just watching. Her father was occupied with his permit paperwork and equipment shuffling from dawn cycle to well past lights down. He checked on her. He trusted her. She had apparently earned that trust through a childhood that sounded, from the occasional things he mentioned, like an extended exercise in getting into situations that required significant adult intervention to resolve. She was, he said once with the rueful smile of a parent who has learned to appreciate their child's qualities even when they're complicated, extremely self-sufficient. He said it like it was a compliment, and also like it explained several gray hairs. Sergeant Dale Okonkwo took to Marin immediately and without any apparent reservation, which was notable because Okonkwo was not a person who warmed to strangers quickly. She was a tall woman, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been somewhere in back. She'd served in the Hegemony Frontier Corps before she took the Kappa 7 posting, and before that, she'd done something in the inner systems that she didn't talk about, and that her personnel file described only as classified conflict operations. I had worked with Okonkwo for 3 years. She had never once mentioned a personal detail voluntarily. Within the first 4 days of Marin's arrival, Okonkwo had told her about growing up in the Nigerian highlands, shown her 3 different close-quarters defensive positions, using the cargo bay wall as a demonstration prop, and given her an unsolicited lecture on the strategic value of identifying exits before you needed them. When I mentioned this to my Thari colleague Velthrin, he blinked his large yellow eyes and said that humans raised each other's young communally in times of stress, and that Okonkwo's behavior indicated she had classified Marin as a dependent to be protected and trained simultaneously, which was apparently very typical of the species. She's teaching her how to survive things, he said. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. The Predator ship arrived on day 19 of the Volkov family's stay at Kappa 7. The technical designation in the Hegemony Incident Report is Unregistered Hegemony Adjacent Vessel Class Verol 4, which is the bureaucratic way of saying it wasn't supposed to be there, and they didn't have a clean category for it in the paperwork. The crew referred to themselves as Kethan, a splinter culture of the Karath species, which are roughly analogous to what humans call apex predators if you started with something between a crocodile and a praying mantis, and then gave it millennia of interstellar civilization and a profound conviction of its own superiority. The Kethan were not technically members of the galactic hegemony. They occupied a complicated political position in the outer systems, too powerful to ignore, not powerful enough to challenge the hegemony directly, and philosophically committed to a worldview that can be summarized as the strong take what they need and the weak exist to demonstrate the contrast. They operated in the outer rim under a series of informal arrangements that the hegemony euphemistically called trade compacts, and that everyone who wasn't writing official documents called extortion and piracy. They had a ship. It was bigger than Kappa 7. Not enormously bigger, we weren't dealing with a dreadnought, but significantly bigger than a logistics station was designed to handle, and its weapons arrays were visible on our long-range sensors even before it dropped out of FTL on our doorstep. I was at my console when it came in. That was when I heard the sound, the breath hold, the settling. Commander Sethek was our station commander, a hegemony career officer, a Belhari, which are a mid-range species by hegemony classification. Not particularly strong, not particularly fast, but good administrators, good problem solvers, politically reliable. He was good at his job in the way that most station commanders were good at their jobs, which is to say, he managed routine operations efficiently and had enough procedural knowledge to handle most crises by routing them to the appropriate hegemony department. What we had in front of us was not a crisis with an appropriate hegemony department. He tried to hail the Kethan ship anyway, because that was the protocol. The response came back in heavily accented hegemony, standard from a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through an industrial shredder. The speaker identified himself as Warlord Caxville of the Kethan Compact Vessel Dominant. He informed us that the Dominant required refueling, resupply, and dock access. He did not say please. He did not say we request or we are asking. He said requires the way that a planet requires a moon, as a statement of gravitational fact. He also said that in exchange for our cooperation, the Dominant would not conduct what he called resource acquisition activities with regard to Kappa 7's personnel and cargo inventory, which was, again in bureaucratic translation, a description of kidnapping and theft so clinical it sounded almost reasonable. Commander Sethek muted the channel and looked at the rest of us at the command table with the expression of a person who has had a terrible, clarifying moment of understanding about the limits of procedure. Options, he said. Okonkwo was already standing. She had been standing since the ship appeared on sensors. She had, at some point in the 3 minutes between the ship's appearance and the hail ending, pulled up the station schematics on the secondary screen and was studying them with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "We can't fight them," she said. "Not I don't think we can fight them. Not it might be difficult to fight them, just the fact delivered clean. We stall. We give them what they want within reason, and we get a distress beacon to the nearest patrol post." "Nearest patrol post is 6 hours out," Ruthaz said. Okonkwo didn't blink. "Then we stall for 6 hours. What nobody said out loud, but everybody on that command deck was thinking, was that the Kethan had a reputation for a specific kind of interest when it came to visiting stations and settlements. They collected things. Not just cargo, not just fuel or materials or the kinds of resources that any piracy operation might target. The Kethan collected specimens, living ones. They had a cultural tradition. The hegemony called it collection culture in official documents, which was another magnificent euphemism, of acquiring representatives of rare or unusual species and keeping them in what were essentially living museums aboard their ships, trophies, status symbols, proof of reach and power. The rarer the species, the more valuable the specimen. Humans were, by hegemony classification, an anomalous species confirmed presence in the galaxy for less than 300 years, population concentrated in a relatively small inner-rim cluster, and possessed of biological and behavioral characteristics so wildly inconsistent with the standard hegemony biological framework, that xenobiologists were still arguing about how to categorize them. They were technically rated as sentient species, Class 7, on the hegemony spectrum, but there were ongoing academic disputes about that classification because Class 7 implied a certain measured baseline of physical capability, and humans did not behave like Class 7s under pressure. To the Kethan, a human specimen was extremely rare. A human child specimen was, as far as we were able to determine later from their communications logs, essentially unprecedented in their collection records. We didn't know about Marin, specifically, at that moment. The Kethan hadn't identified her yet. But we all knew she was on station, and we all understood, without anyone having to say it in those particular words, that she could not under any circumstances be allowed to fall into the Kethan's awareness. Okonkwo said it very quietly, to me specifically, while Sethek was composing his carefully worded stalling response to the dominant. "Get the girl, bring her to me, don't use the station comm." I went. Part 2. The girl in the observation bay. I found Marin where I expected to find her. She was in the observation bay, sitting in her usual spot, the wide ledge that ran along the base of the transparent panels, just high enough for a small person to sit with their back to the station's interior and their face to the stars. She had her pad in her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She was watching the dominant. She'd been watching it since it dropped out of FTL. I realized this when I saw the expression on her face, not fear, not confusion, but the particular focused quality she had when she was measuring something. She'd already clocked it. She already knew it wasn't supposed to be there, and she'd been sitting here for the past 15 minutes cataloging it. "That's a Kethan War compact vessel," she said when I came through the door. She didn't look at me. "The weapons arrays on the lateral hull are Varel specification. They're second generation, which means the ship is old but the armaments are upgraded. That's interesting." I stopped walking. "How do you know what Kethan weapon specifications look like?" "I asked Chief Ruthaz about weapon classification last week. He showed me the standard registry." She finally looked at me. "Why are you here? Something happened." There was absolutely no point in being indirect with this child. I told her. I told her about the hail, the warlord's demands, Okonkwo's plan to stall. I told her, as carefully as I could, that Kethan vessels sometimes engaged in species collection, and that humans were considered a notable acquisition, and that she needed to be very quiet and very hidden until the situation was resolved. She listened, she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for about 4 seconds, not panicked quiet, processing quiet, and then she said, "Where's my dad?" "He's in the permit processing office. We're going to bring him to you." "Okay," she stood up, tucking her pad under her arm. "Where am I hiding?" "Sergeant Okonkwo wants you in the security office. Deck 3, inner ring." Marin nodded. Then she looked back out the observation panel at the dominant, which was now close enough that you could see its running lights without sensor magnification. It was a dark ship, deep charcoal and something that was almost purple, with geometric patterns etched into the hull that I later learned were Kethan victory markings. The ship moved with a kind of deliberate slowness that was more threatening than speed would have been, like it knew nothing out here could stop it. "They've already deployed a sensor sweep," she said. "You can see it, the shimmer around the aft array. They're cataloging the station." I looked. I hadn't noticed. She was right. "Marin, we need to move." She came without argument. But she looked back once more at the window, and the expression on her face wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger, really. It was something more specific, something I've seen since, on video, in historical documents about humans in situations where something they considered theirs was being threatened. I know now what to call it. I didn't then. Okonkwo's security office was a room that suited her personality, compact, functional, and arranged for maximum awareness of multiple entry points. She had eyes on 3 camera feeds, the station's external sensor display, and the command deck's secondary output all at once. When Marin walked in, Okonkwo looked at her the way you look at a resource you've been trying to protect and are relieved to see intact. "You know what's happening," Okonkwo said. "It wasn't a question." "Kethan collection run," Marin said. "Coordinator Sav told me." Okonkwo glanced at me. I shrugged my secondary limbs in the Sethani gesture that means she already knew half of it. "They're going to want a dock," Okonkwo said. "We're giving them dock access to Bay 7. That's the cargo bay farthest from the residential sections. We're going to keep them in that zone for as long as we can." She was already moving to the weapons locker. "Your father's on his way here. When he arrives, I need you both to stay in this room. No comm signals out because they'll be monitoring. No movement through the outer corridors." "What about the 15-second sensor lag on the outer perimeter?" Marin said. Okonkwo stopped, slowly turned to look at her. "What about it?" "If their sensor sweep is syncing with our array's refresh cycle, they're getting a partial picture of the station interior. Deck 3 inner ring shows up on the outer array with a 5-second delay. But if they're sweeping on the standard hegemony frequency, the inner ring doesn't ping at the same resolution as the outer sections." She paused. "I mapped it." Okonkwo looked at her for a long moment. "You mapped our sensor coverage." I was bored, and the ventilation in the observation bay is better than the residential section. I spent a lot of time there, so I started mapping what I could see and what I couldn't. She held out her pad. "This room, the security office, has a significant blind spot in the standard hegemony sweep frequency. You might want to know that." Okonkwo took the pad. She studied it for about 30 seconds. Her expression didn't change. Okonkwo's expressions rarely did. But something in her posture shifted in the way that I had come to recognize as her taking something seriously. "How accurate is this?" she said. "Pretty accurate. Ruthaz could tell you better." Okonkwo handed the pad back. "Sit down. Don't touch anything unless I tell you." Marin sat. Her father arrived 14 minutes later, out of breath and pale but steady. He was a tall man, broad across the back, with the kind of controlled worry on his face that parents develop when their child is in consistent proximity to interesting situations. He held Marin's shoulder for a moment, the way parents do, that quick press that communicates, "I see you, I need a second to breathe, you're okay." Then he looked at Okonkwo and said, "Tell me what we're dealing with." He was a scientist. She told him concisely and without softening it, and he listened the same way Marin had listened, without interrupting, filing everything. "They'll identify us," he said. "If they're doing a thorough biological sweep, human biosignatures aren't subtle." "I know." "How long before they identify us specifically?" "We're buying time. 6 hours is the estimate for patrol response." Dr. Volkov looked at his daughter. Marin was sitting exactly where Okonkwo had told her to sit, her pad in her lap. She met her father's eyes. Something passed between them, one of those parent-child communications that happens without words, and then he nodded and sat down beside her. "Okay," he said. Part 3, the hour the Kethan came aboard. They docked at Bay 7, 53 minutes after the initial hail. We had stalled. We had gone through the permit verification process at excruciating length, citing 3 different subsections of the Outer Rim Transit Compact that technically required documentation before any unregistered vessel could dock with a hegemony-affiliated station. Sethek had been magnificent in his bureaucratic obstruction. He was, after all, a Belhari, and Belhari understand paperwork the way other species understand combat. He wrung 47 minutes of delay out of a process that should have taken 5, and he did it without ever being technically incorrect, which meant the Kethan couldn't object on clear grounds. But they docked eventually. I watched the feed from Bay 7. There were 12 of them, which was more than a standard resupply crew and fewer than a raiding party, which told you something about what they considered themselves to be. They were large, even by Kethan standards. Warlord Caxville's crew ran big, which probably explained the crew selection. They moved through Base 7 with the unhurried confidence of predators who know the prey can't run. Warlord Caxville himself was the largest. He was nearly 3 meters, which is on the taller end for Karath-related species, with the characteristic overlapping armor plates of the Kethan warrior caste. Not armor they wore, plates that were part of their body, hardened layers of chitin and cartilage that formed natural protection over the vital areas of their torso. His face was a horizontal split, the wide lipless mouth of the Karath, lined with interlocking teeth that weren't quite serrated and weren't quite flat, something in between that was efficient for both tearing and grinding. His eyes were forward-facing, compound but with a similar tracking range to predator mammals. He wore the markers of a Kethan warlord on the plates across his shoulders, colored lacquer and carved bone, a visual display of kills and acquisitions. He was, in the honest language of biology, a very successful predator. He was also watching the sensor readout on a device strapped to his wrist. I knew what that meant before the alert came through. He'd found the biosignature. The message came through on the official station comm, and Warlord Caxville did not dress it up. "This station contains human biological subjects," he said, in hegemony standard that was accented but precise, because the Kethan had not survived as a power in the Outer Rim by being unable to communicate effectively. "Humans are not registered in your station manifest. I require their location." Commander Sethek responded with the composure of a man who was absolutely terrified and wasn't going to show it. "Our manifest includes all registered personnel. Any anomalies in your bioscan are likely the result of sensor interference from our fuel depot arrays. We have noted such interference before, and you have a human adult male and a human juvenile female on this station," Caxville said. "The juvenile is of particular interest. I will have their location within the next 10 minutes, or I will acquire their location independently. The outcome is the same. The question is the condition of your station afterward." Sethek looked at the camera, looked at me, specifically, because he knew I was watching, with the expression of a man asking a question without words. I didn't have an answer. But Okonkwo's voice came through my earpiece a second later, very quiet, very level. "Tell them the humans are in the residential section. Give them Deck 2, not Deck 3. I relayed. Sethek, without hesitation, gave Caxville the wrong deck. It bought us 19 minutes. The problem with Kethan on a station is that they are not subtle about their movements. They don't need to be. They are large enough and confident enough that subtlety has never been a survival requirement. They move through the public corridors of Kappa 7 like they own them, because in their assessment they more or less did. Our security team, 9 officers, mix of species, none of them Kethan or Kethan equivalent in terms of physical capability, stayed back. This was the right call. Okonkwo had ordered it. Engaging a 12 Kethan boarding crew in a station corridor was not a fight we could win, and winning wasn't the goal anyway. Stalling was the goal. The 19 minutes came from the Kethan moving through Deck 2 residential, and finding nothing but empty crew quarters and a very confused Thari maintenance worker, named Velthrin, who had no idea what was happening, and whose confusion was so genuine that even the Kethan took a few minutes to verify it wasn't deception. When they realized we'd misdirected them, Caxville came back to the comm. His voice had changed, not louder, which would have been reassuring in a way because it would have suggested he was losing control. It was quieter, more focused. "Your next misdirection will cost you one of your docking arms," he said. He meant it. He had the firepower to do it from where his ship sat. One docking arm, we'd have lost Bay 3 through Bay 5 function, and any ship in those bays would be unable to undock. He knew the math. He knew we knew the math. Commander Sethek looked at me again. And this time I didn't have an answer, and Okonkwo's earpiece was silent, and I didn't know what the next move was. Part 4, What the Honey Badger Did. What I'm about to describe is the part that nobody fully understood in the moment it was happening. We understood it afterward, partially from the sensor logs, partially from Marin's own account, and partially from the testimony of the Kethan crew themselves, which was extracted from their official hegemony debrief several months later and made for remarkable reading. At the moment when Warlord Caxville threatened to destroy our docking arm, Marin Volkov was in the security office on Deck 3 with her father and a 2-officer detail that Okonkwo had left with them. Okonkwo herself had moved. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, which was typical, and the 2 officers she'd left were competent but not Okonkwo, which is to say they were good at following orders and not necessarily good at adapting when the situation changed. The situation changed. The sensor alert that came through was a secondary sweep. The Kethan had deployed a second scanner drone, smaller, meant for exactly the kind of interior mapping that their first bioscan had started. It was sweeping the inner ring. It was going to find Deck 3. One of the officers, his name was Brex, a Gelathi, good reflexes, solid under pressure, saw the alert and said, "We need to move them again, deeper into the station." He was right, they needed to move. But while Brex was pulling up a secondary route map, Marin was looking at something else. She was looking at the sensor display in the security office, the one Okonkwo had eyes on when she was in the room, and she was looking at the drone's sweep pattern, and she was cross-referencing it with the map on her pad, the map of the station's sensor coverage that she'd spent 3 weeks building out of boredom and curiosity. "Officer Brex," she said. He was still pulling up the route. "In a moment." "Officer Brex." Her voice was very calm, not the calm of someone who isn't scared. I've listened to the audio recordings many times. There's something in her voice that is absolutely fear. She was scared. She just wasn't letting the fear make her decisions. "The drone is sweeping on a 17-second interval, rotating clockwise. If we move now toward the inner corridor, we'll be in the open during the sweep window. We need to wait 11 seconds and then move." Brex stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the display. He looked back at her. He waited 11 seconds. Then he moved them, Dr. Volkov's hand on his daughter's shoulder as they went, down the inner corridor toward the deeper sections of the station. The drone completed its sweep 8 seconds after they cleared the corridor. The security office registered empty. It bought another 14 minutes. But here's the part that's harder to explain, the part that I think about a lot. While Brex was moving Dr. Volkov and Marin deeper into the station, Marin was doing something else simultaneously. She was using her personal pad, which was not connected to the station comm system, because Okonkwo had taken her off the comm to prevent Kethan monitoring, to access the station's maintenance network, which was a completely separate system that Okonkwo hadn't thought to include in the blackout, because the maintenance network was theoretically for things like environmental controls, docking clamp management, and cargo lift sequencing. Marin had spent 3 weeks noticing things. One of the things she had noticed was that the outer perimeter sensor array, the one with the 15-second lag that Chief Ruthaz had explained to her, was connected to the same maintenance network as the docking arm controls. One of the other things she had noticed was that a 15-second lag in a sensor array, in an emergency, could be adjusted. Not permanently and not easily, but the calibration settings were in the maintenance network, accessible to anyone with maintenance-level access, which Ruthaz had given her 3 days ago because she'd asked if she could help run some diagnostics, and he'd been short-staffed that week, and she had, in his words, more precision than most of my junior technicians. She wasn't adjusting the sensor lag. What she was doing was more specific than that. She was looking at the maintenance logs for the Dominance docking connection, Because when a ship docks with a station, there's a physical connection, the airlock coupling, the umbilical lines for fuel and atmosphere management, the data exchange handshake that allows for basic navigation coordination. And that connection runs through the maintenance network. And the maintenance network had records of exactly what data the dominant was pulling through its connection. The Kethan were pulling the station's internal layout from the maintenance network's structural database. That was how they'd known which deck to look on. They weren't just doing external bioscan sweeps. They were using the docking connection to access the station's own floor plan. She saw this and she understood it, and she made a decision. She changed the database. Not all of it, not dramatically. Just one specific floor plan, Deck 3, Inner Ring, Security Office. She moved the room. In the maintenance network structural database, the security office now occupied a different corridor junction on Deck 3. The change was subtle enough that it wouldn't trigger an obvious error. But the Kethan scanner drone, which was using the maintenance network's floor plan to interpret its own bioscan data, would now map the inner corridor to a location that didn't exist. She then flagged the change in a maintenance log note as calibration error, under review, so that the system itself wouldn't flag it as a discrepancy. She did all of this on a pad in a moving corridor, while also following Officer Brex's navigation instructions and not falling behind. Dr. Volkov told me later that he didn't know what she was doing until they were in the new position and she showed him. He said his immediate response was, "How did you know you had access to do that?" And she said, "I helped Ruthaz with maintenance diagnostics last week. He gave me the access level. I just didn't revoke it." He said he sat with that for a moment and then said, "You should probably tell Sergeant Okonkwo." She said, "I'll tell her when she finds us." Okonkwo found them 18 minutes later. By that point, the situation in the main station had escalated. Caxville had received 2 misleading sensor reports that placed the humans in locations where they turned out not to be. He was not a stupid being. Stupid beings don't survive as long as he had in the outer rim, and he had correctly concluded that the station was actively deceiving him. He had also correctly concluded that the deception was more organized and effective than he would have expected from a small logistics station with a minimal security force. What he could not figure out was how. His own crew was working through the problem. They'd pulled the maintenance database and were using it as ground truth. But the maintenance database had a discrepancy on Deck 3 that their analysts had flagged as a calibration error and set aside as non-critical. They were looking at a floor plan where the room they wanted didn't exist where their sensors said it should be. Meanwhile, Okonkwo had found Marin, had been shown the pad, and had sat very still for about 10 seconds while she processed what she was looking at. Then she said, "You modified the station's maintenance database." "Just one room," Marin said. "I can put it back when this is done." "You also flagged it as a calibration error, so the system wouldn't self-correct." "I didn't know how long we'd need it." Okonkwo looked at Dr. Volkov. He spread his hands in a gesture that clearly communicated, "I raised her. I accept partial responsibility. I'm not entirely sure how." Okonkwo turned back to Marin. "What else did you see when you were in the maintenance network?" And that's when Marin told her about the data pull. The fact that the Kethan were pulling the station's structural database through the docking connection. That they had been using the station's own architecture against it. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you see what else they're pulling?" "I've been watching. They're requesting the life support system layout, the ventilation map." Okonkwo's expression sharpened. "They're planning for environmental control. If they can get the ventilation map, they can pump something through the system." "Yes," Marin said. "Can you lock them out of the maintenance network access through the docking connection?" Marin looked at the pad. "I don't know. I can try to see if the access permissions." "Try."